Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me. It is the Thursday edition of Point of View, and we're going to be covering a lot of different topics, so stay tuned, as we certainly are going to talk about what is happening on Christian universities around the campus, around the country as well, and really kind of the state of higher education. Also going to mention Mike Pence. I'll get to that in just a minute. Then we're going to get into the subject of anti-Semitism. Michael Rydelnik is with us, and will be with us later this hour as we talk about a summit that was done. And then we're going to get back to, of course, all sorts of cabinet posts. Marco Rubio heading up the State Department, what Elon Musk has planned for the government Efficiency Commission, Tulsi Gabbard at the whole area of national intelligence, and much, much more. So we'll get into all sorts of very important topics in the news. And anyway, along the way, if you'd like to join the conversation, feel free to give us a call. That number is 1-800-351-1212. When it comes to Eric Hogue, he is the president of Colorado Christian University. He is an individual who in the past served as the vice president of advancement for Colorado Christian University, earned a bachelor's degree from William Jessup University, a master's of arts from Liberty University. An individual that has been a pastor, is certainly a well-known radio, television, media professional, but even a former political candidate, author of The Winning Side of the Ask, and joins us now by phone. So, Eric, thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Hey, Kerby, it's great to be with you. Thank you for the invite.
Let's talk about Mike Pence. We've known him for decades around here at Point of View. Of course, he is no longer serving in the cabinet, but as an individual that I believe you have come in to speak tomorrow.
Yeah, Mike is the 48th president or vice president of the United States, is attending campus. He's the first out of the gate for my President Speaker series, both Mike and Karen. Karen, the former second lady, is coming at the request of my bride, the first lady here, to talk about education, and then Mike coming in to talk about leadership in the midst of a tumult that he was placed in 2021, as well as just the scope of post-election opinion and forecasting. So I'm honored to have my good friend Mike on campus.
I might just mention, too, we posted your article on leadership. We'll get to that in just a minute. But when you talk about an individual like that, I know some people don't like how January 6th turned out. But again, we've known him for a long time, first as a talk show host, and then a member of Congress, and then a governor, and then, of course, the vice president. And because of the real diversity of experiences he's had, similar to some of the diversity of experiences you've had, I think he really brings a lot to the table in terms of really understanding what leadership is and how to develop leaders for the 21st century.
Yeah, I agree, Kerby. I mean, first of all, we're both radio guys, so that means we have a face for radio. Kerby, I don't know if I want to be pejorative and include you in on that, but we joke about the fact that the radio has blessed us down the road. Here's the take that I personally have on January 6th, and this is my opinion. I mean, we have a number of concerns of how election went down, how it turned out, or what have you. But the vice president, Mike Pence, at that time had a duty because he put his hand on the holy word of God and took an oath to protect the Constitution, and he upheld that. It was leadership in the midst of a tumult. If you go back in history, 1860, the vice president was John C. Breckinridge. He was a Democrat. And he had a situation as vice president with a candidate that was just named president-elect. His name was Abraham Lincoln. And Breckinridge had a lot of personal interest involved. He could have attacked the Electoral College. He could have went after a plurality of popular vote with 4 candidates, Bell and Douglas being in the mix. He had a split on the Northern abolitionists and the Southern cessationists. And he had numerous reasons to not certify the vote. But Breckinridge, although it was against his own vote, he was not an abolitionist, wasn't a support of Abraham Lincoln, but he certified the Electoral College. And he did what was right. John Meacham highlights him in his book about Abraham Lincoln.
Right.
In some situations, leadership takes someone to stand without self-interest and do the right thing, do the duty of defending the Constitution, especially when you have an oath before God in the process of doing it.
Well, while we're talking about leadership, let me just mention we've posted your article that has come out, Embracing the CEO Mindset of Higher Education Leadership. But I thought before we got into too much of it, you begin by reminding us that right now, a lot of these higher education institutions, not just the Christian ones, although I know they're facing some issues too, but all of them are facing lower enrollments. Younger people are not necessarily going to college, and of course, you can see the impact of the pandemic and the lockdown and those kinds of things. Because of that, tighter budgets, because inflation has certainly affected that. And then the problem with student outcomes, turns out that we're not necessarily producing the best and the brightest out of these institutions. So is it fair to say that higher education's in a bit of a crisis right now?
Yeah, I think you're right, Kerby. Generally, it is. I mean, the Ivies are hurting for obvious reasons as to what has happened around Israel and the encampments and the protests. I think a lot of higher education institutions have lost their way on the liberal arts, what it means to actually think and search for truth, to hunger for truth, to know that there is something called truth. I think many organizations, in higher ed are dependent upon government handouts. They're not sustainable. They sit on large endowments, and they don't spend from them, and they charge the students more and more and more each and every year. They don't operate good business models. They're not sustainable. They don't expect profitable margins at the end of each division. The academics aren't worth it, and the rigor in the coursework is much more along the lines of agendas and wokeness than it is academics. So my word to anybody who is listening, if indeed you want your son or daughter to go to college, I would pick a convictional, intentional, mission-adherent, Christ-centered university that has a brand and demand. You say who you are, you act that way, and you make sure that the outcomes are a benefit to the students. Dwindling population means that you're going to have to do a much better job of educating students who choose your institution and doing it with academics versus nothing more than agenda and wokeism.
We're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about embracing the CEO mindset in higher education. But again, as we have mentioned many times before, one of those institutions you might want to check out is Colorado Christian University. I've got a young woman that is our neighborhood that is actually now freshman enrolled there. And when we've had Lee Strobel on, sometimes we've talked about the Lee Strobel Center at the Colorado Christian University, but all sorts of other Christian colleges and universities are worthy of your consideration as well. So thought we might spend just a moment talking about that. And of course, if you find yourself saying, well, I'd like to know a little bit more about that, of course, we have that information there. And of course, we've posted this article, which we're going to come back and talk about what that means. And Eric has spent time both in the fundraising side of this, but also now in the CEO or president side. And I think he brings some very helpful information to you. Whether you're going to ever run a university is not the issue. These leadership principles apply whether or not you're raising your kids or even serving in your own church. So we'll talk about those right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Elon Musk noted on X that giving more money to homeless charities in California did not seem to reduce the number of homeless people. In response, Konstantin Kisin reminded him of the Cobra effect, and he was surprised to discover how many people hadn't heard of it. Now, the Cobra effect is based upon a story which may or may not have taken place during British colonial rule in India. According to the story, the British wanted to reduce the cobra population and offered a bounty for every dead cobra. But the cobra problem got worse because people realized that they could profit from this bounty and began raising cobras in farms. Now, when the government finally became aware of this practice, they discontinued the bounty program. The cobra breeders then decided to release their worthless snakes into the wild, making the problem worse. In the past, I've talked about how the cobra effect surfaced in the attempt to combat racism. Anti-racist groups and organizations formed to combat racism, but they soon faced a problem. The demand to find racism was much larger than the supply. Soon we were hearing about such things as microaggressions, and the charge of racism was thrown around indiscriminately. The problem of homelessness in California, Kisin argues, came not only from the attempts to deal with failing, but also with the results of well-intentioned policies, the deinstitutionalization movement, whose goal was to free people of the tyranny of mental asylums. The mentally ill people released into the streets fell through the cracks. Today, cities are littered with tents and drug addicts on the streets. These are just two examples of many others that remind us that good intentions don't always solve social problems. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on biblical reliability, go to viewpoints.info/biblical reliability. Viewpoints.info/biblical reliability. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation for a few more minutes with Eric Hogue. I think you'll appreciate some of his insights as the president of Colorado Christian University. The article we've posted here is one that you can read, but you could also, of course, listen to it. The episode is The Higher Ed Marketeer, and it is all about, in that podcast, some of these issues. And I think one of the things that, Ed, you bring to the conversation, Eric, I should say, bring to the conversation, is simply this idea that we need to think about such issues as maybe profitability and efficiency and growth and things of that nature. Next hour, we're going to be talking about Elon Musk, who is heading up the Department of Government Efficiency Commission, 428 federal agencies. We have more agencies, he says, than we have years the Republic has been in existence. Many of them are conflicting with one another, and they're not very accountable. Now, you've been in the corporate world where there's a lot of accountability because you have to make a profit and you have to meet the needs of the customers. What's so interesting is higher education is sort of in between. There's a sense in which you have customers, that is students, but there is also a sense in which higher education almost is immune from some of the market forces, because if the costs go up, well, the government will just provide more funding and provide higher student loans. And so in some respects, when you're talking about bringing a CEO mindset to higher education, you're kind of a little bit different than the typical president of many of these universities, aren't you?
Well, definitely so, although I think the trend is growing, Kerby. There's a lot of my colleagues that were fundraisers at other Christian universities that are now presidents at Christian universities. And when you think about, Christ-centered higher ed, we don't always get the benefit of the government or legislation.
Right.
If we don't get the state dollars, the students can't spend it here. They can use their Pell. That may go away. And I think that was the trigger for me moving from private sector into nonprofit, is that one day we could be too niche, too narrow for the government to allow students, there'll be a lawsuit on this, but allow students to use their Pell Grant at schools like Colorado Christian University. So
Right.
what do we need to do?
Yeah.
Well, we need to be sustainable. So you can't run it with high bureaucracy. You can't run a debt like the federal government. Go get them, Elon. You got to cut bureaucracy, cut departments, and then you got to say you have to make a profit. Is that program, the program in electrical engineering, is it driving a profit? Do you have the right number of students? Do you have too many faculty? Do you have tenure? Do you have tenure faculty? Get rid of tenure. You can't afford it. I mean, run it like a business and let the board of trustees operate like shareholders as well as your donors. Treat them like shareholders and investors, and you'll turn things around.
One of the biggest issues, of course, comes out of the pandemic and the lockdown, and that is we've always had online education, but that jump-started all of that, and it is possible now to go to secular universities and even Christian universities and take all your courses online, and the only time maybe you set foot on campus maybe is when you get your diploma, if then. And so what about that? That's kind of a changing kind of model there as well, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. It is. Now, once again, if you enroll at Colorado Christian University as a traditional residential student, you can only take 15 credit hours online. We still want our 18 to 23-year-old students, residential, in-seat, in-chapel, in discipleship groups, before mentors, faculty studying. They can take 15 credit hours in their full scope of 4 years, whatever it takes to graduate. But there has been a growth of online education. Question has been, is it rigorous? I say it is rigorous, but it's rigorous in a different tone. 18 to 23 on campus, a little bit different than a 43-year-old mother, 2 kids with a job, trying to finish her undergrad and get a master's for a promotion online. There's rigor there. She has a lot of other rigor pressing on her, but the rigor needs to fit the student, and the rigors are different, and the students are different, and the in-seat is terrifically different than the online. But there is a growth and a need and a position for both. And there's a lot of Christian adults, families who want an education or a specialty certification so that they can do more in their calling, and the online is beneficial for them and their family.
And again, I appreciate your attitude, because it seems to me that a college experience is more than just being able to master some of the courses, because there is the interaction with fellow students, there is the accountability, there are the small groups and the growth groups and the chapel experiences and meeting other individuals and hearing dynamic speakers. Of course, you'll have Mike Pence there tomorrow. It just seems to me that there are just so many things that are part of the college experience that go beyond and are necessary other than just the online courses.
You're absolutely right. I mean, the 18 to 23-year-old is moving into a community, and many of them, for the first time, they're going to live 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 10 months a year. And so they're going to learn how to live in community, how to study, how to adult, which is really important, how to deal with being homesick and mental health issues escalating these days. All of that happens in a very intentional community, and here at CCU, intentional in the grace and truth of Jesus Christ.
We can also learn from you for just a few minutes about this idea of fundraising, because, again, as you pointed out, you have worked in advancement. Many presidents have as well. And, of course, I know one of the things you talk about is friend raising over fundraising. We've talked about this occasionally on this program, and certainly with individuals that are involved with stewardship at Point of View or a variety of other institutions that I've worked with or even sat on boards with. This idea of friend raising is different. Can you explain that?
Yeah, it's funny that you would bring this up. I'm going to depart from our time here, and I'm going to meet a prospective new donor in my office in about 20 minutes. One of my board members is bringing a new friend by, and our conversation over a cup of coffee will be what his interest is in Colorado Christian University, and why he might be philanthropic, and I'm going to listen. And I'm not going to tell him about our campaigns. I'm not going to persuade him. I'm not going to sell him. I'm not going to make a proposal. I'm going to listen. And we might have a second and third meeting coming up. But my whole focus is to be donor-centric. And donor-centric is for me to move from my chair to his side of the table to see what he and his wife want to do for the kingdom of God and see if it's a fit here at CCU. Here's the best part. If it's not, I'll help him find a ministry that's better for his intentions for the kingdom. So the goal is not transactional. The goal is relationship. And in that relationship, listening. And in that listening, discover what the donor wants to do. And when you discover that, and if you can do it with them, you have just won the relationship of being able to fund that next project.
Yes. And I've seen a lot of people that are doing advancement, stewardship, and the rest, and they're doing the very same thing. My argument oftentimes when I meet with an individual is whether you support Point of View or Dallas Theological Seminary or Probe Ministries or Liberty University, I always just thank them for whoever they are supporting because it's all part of the kingdom. And that, I think, very much impresses most of those individuals to recognize that whether you're giving to our organization or not, we're certainly grateful for the fact that you are a good steward of some of those resources. But just before I let you go, I really want to encourage people not only to maybe read your article, but also to go to ccu.edu, because one of the things you see when you go to that website is that it's a top-tier academic institution. 100% of the online courses taught for the Christian worldview, so whether you're on campus or taking some of those online courses, there's just a great way for people to be educated and to develop a Christian world and life view over every area of life.
Kerby, thank you. Appreciate that. It is a great Christian university, and we stand today on the shoulders of many men and women who have gone before us, and we are grateful for God's sovereign hand and what he has done here at CCU. Kerby, you've been a blessing. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And again, let me just encourage you to go to that website. You're going to find out a little bit more, ccu.edu. By the way, I might mention that we do have cameras in studio, so you can make your own decision as to whether or not I have a face for radio or whether or not Eric does as well. But I thought it was a great opportunity to learn a little bit more about this. And this is a time of year when, of course, we're coming to fiscal year end. We're really thinking about supporting different ministries, and I know that there has been a real hesitation on the part of a lot of people in this country because of the election. As we'll talk about next hour, the election is over, and some of the uncertainty is over as well. And I found that people do not invest in organizations. They do not invest in the stock market. They do not give to Christian organizations, oftentimes where there's uncertainty. But as we come to year end, I hope that you will consider what you might do, first of all, to support the radio station that is carrying this program right now. If they indeed raise funds, I hope that you will consider supporting them. And then number two, I hope you might think about us as well. I want you to support your church, support certainly the organizations that have been a ministry to you, but I hope you'll consider supporting us as well. And if you're thinking about going to college, even for graduate education, maybe taking online courses or being a student, you might want to check out Colorado Christian University. Let's take a break. We'll be back with more right after this.
Many years ago, they began saying that we live in the information age. Well, today there is so much information coming at us from every direction. The hardest thing is to discern which issues are really important and how can I make a positive impact without wasting my time trying to figure out accurate information. Let me give you a suggestion to help with that. Visit pointofview.net. Look at the tabs across the top. Find the one named Viewpoints. Kerby Anderson and others on our team are constantly watching for news to identify those issues that you really need to know about. They boil things down in a brief summary, and then you can decide if it's something on which you want to learn more and get involved. Again, when you go to pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints, you'll see exactly what I mean. You'll see the issues that we are covering right now. And when you like what you see, I honestly think you will, you can slide on over, enter your email, and get them automatically sent to your inbox each day. That's it. Take a minute now, be informed. Pointofview.net, click on Viewpoints. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again, is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, we're going to talk about anti-Semitism for a little bit, and there's a very good set of reasons for that. First of all, let me hold up the booklet that I put together just last year on anti-Semitism, but you might remember that 5 years before I'd written one on the subject, but of course we had October 7th, and that changed everything. And so whereas before I was talking about some of those things like blood libel and the various evidences of anti-Semitism in Western culture, of course, going all the way back to the book of Esther, for example. But we began to notice some other things developing in terms of anti-Semitism, this idea of critical theory and how there has been such support sometimes on college campuses of Hamas and such a vilification of Jews and the nation of Israel. So hence this newer book on this whole idea of a biblical point of view on anti-Semitism. And I thought it would be good to revisit this because our friends at Moody Bible Institute, working also with Chosen People Ministries, put together a summit on opposing anti-Semitism. So to give us some understanding of the conference and how to think this through, we bring to the microphone Dr. Michael Rydelnik. He is Vice President, Academic Dean at Moody Bible Institute, also Professor of Jewish Studies. For those of you that listen to Open Line and the Moody Broadcasting Network, of course, he is the host and Bible teacher. He is the son of a Holocaust survivors raised in an observant Jewish home in Brooklyn. You may have seen some of his works in things like the Moody Bible Commentary, the Moody Handbook on Messianic Prophecy. And Dr. Michael Rydelnik, thank you for being with us today here on Point of View.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Let's, if we can, talk about the conference, because one of the things that is posted on this summit is, you said, after the Holocaust, the world exclaimed never again to the hatred of the Jewish people. Yet now, once again, hate for God's chosen people is exploding in the United States and around the world. In my booklets that I've come out with, I document how significant that has been over the years in Europe, and now we're seeing it here in America. So that's one of the reasons why you felt it was appropriate to have this summit.
Yeah, it was the idea of the summit came months and months ago as we saw what was happening on the college campuses with the university at Columbia University, Harvard University, and all these different places. But it was confirmed just 2.5 weeks ago in my neighborhood. I live in a very Orthodox Jewish neighborhood in Chicago, and a man, this made national news. He was just walking to synagogue on a Saturday morning, 2 blocks from where I walk my dogs. I mean, this is where I go every day. And a man came out, shouted Allahu Akbar, and shot him in the back. After he was charged with attempted murder, the man who did this, they looked at his phone and discovered that he had all sorts of anti-Semitic targeting that he was doing, and finally he was charged with a hate crime. But it took some persistence on the part of the local alderwoman, like a city council kind of person here in Chicago, to get it done. This is not something unusual. We see violence against Jewish people all around the country, and it's just a few days ago here in Chicago, 2 Jewish DePaul students were assaulted and had ribs broken and wrist broken, and just for being Jewish. It's a serious problem.
Well, and again, we've recognized that it is in the culture, but also there seem to be some individuals in government. I'm thinking of Rashida Tlaib, Representative Ilhan Omar, and others. So it's carried out sometimes because of some statements that are given some credence from people that are members of Congress. I think back a while back, Whoopi Goldberg said, the Holocaust isn't about race. And and so there probably is more need, Michael, for education about this issue of anti-Semitism than ever before. And that's, of course, why you did the summit, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. And we had some really exceptional speakers. One in particular we had Dr. Mark Joe, president of Moody, and I had the privilege of speaking, and Mitch Glaser. But one of the most outspoken speakers on this issue of critical theory and anti-Semitism is Dr. Don Sweeting,
Right.
who's the chancellor of Colorado Christian University. And that's what he brought to it. It was much more of an evaluation and critical assessment of critical theory and how that affects. I mean, obviously, it's contrary to the Word of God, but he analyzed that and did an exceptional job with that as well. There were also breakout groups, and it's because people don't even understand how serious a problem it is. They don't realize.
And I might just mention, too, that we just had the president of Colorado Christian University on the first half, and here Don Sweeting is the chancellor of Colorado Christian University, so they're getting a good press. So, of course, is Moody Bible Institute. But let's talk about that for just a minute, because that's why, and I'll hold this up for those of you watching online, this new book, it's a newer one on anti-Semitism. Perhaps those of you that collect these, and we've got at least 70 or more of these booklets that I put out once a month to our donors. In the past, that was not as much of an issue. We were just talking about kind of the classic kinds of issues about Holocaust denial and a variety of other issues. But this idea of critical theory is that if an individual's in power, they are by definition oppressors. And if you are then being, you're weak, then you're a victim. And so when 1948 Israel began, well, we sort of saw Israel as David versus Goliath, but now they see Israel as the Goliath. And it is amazing to me how that has caught hold, especially even sometimes in these Christian universities, with this idea that, well, I can't support Israel because they're actually destroying Hamas, they're fighting Hezbollah, they're destroying the Palestinians, when I think there has been pretty good evidence that there is an attempt on the part of IDF and Israel to really want to support the Palestinian people, but not allow terrorists to destroy the nation of Israel. Is that fair?
Yeah, the war right now is with Hamas and Hezbollah. It's not against the Palestinians or the Lebanese. In fact, I speak from experience, not just from having many friends that have served in the IDF, having students currently who are IDF reservists at this point, but my son served in the IDF, and they were trained. He was in a close-quarter urban combat unit. They were trained to risk their own lives to preserve the lives, to protect the lives of civilians, Palestinian civilians, when they are in these kinds of situations. Israel gives directions about where to go to safe zones, about where they're coming in, and they jeopardize their own military actions by trying to make sure that people are safe. This idea that Israel is somehow committing genocide is one of the most devious lies. There's no genocide happening. In fact, John Spencer from the United States War College, Army, the West Point specialist in close-quarter urban combat, says that Israel has the lowest historical ratio of combatant to civilian deaths in close-quarter urban combat because they are so meticulous, so careful about trying not to harm civilians. So it's just part of the propaganda racket to try and get the world to turn. You know what you were saying about this thing about that there's a new kind of anti-Semitism. You know, the progressive left, the radical left, celebrated Israel in 1948.
Yes,
they supported the idea of Israel. What they said was, this is the first example of the indigenous people coming back and establishing a state after colonialism. And then in 1967, when Israel had that great victory, when they were threatened with extinction, and they had the great Six-Day War victory, all of a sudden, that same radical left flipped, and all of a sudden made Israel the oppressor and the Palestinians the oppressed. It is a remarkable shift that happened. You can trace it right to 1967 and the Six-Day War.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll continue our conversation with Michael Rydelnik. And Dr. Rydelnik, of course, is the Vice President, Academic Dean at Moody Bible Institute, also a Professor of Jewish Studies, and, of course, the host and Bible teacher on Open Line, which I would encourage you to listen to. If you have a Moody station near you, you might want to listen to Moody Radio, or, of course, you can go online and hear it at any point. And some of the resources I want to put in your hands, I'll hold up this one on anti-Semitism, which we've been making available. It's free of charge. If you want to contact us, we'll send it to you. Also, since we just got into it a minute ago, also did a booklet on Israel in terms of some of the history, because sometimes you have to know a little bit more about the history about the Yom Kippur War and the Six-Day War and a variety of other things, and various attempts to push forward a land for peace and all the things that haven't worked very well. So again, some of those are resources we want to put in your hands so that you, first of all, understand those ideas, but number two, if you're in conversation with people, can make a case. But we'll continue our conversation with Dr. Michael Rydelnik. All that coming up right after this.
You're listening to Point of View. your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation for a few more minutes with Dr. Michael Rydelnik. Again, he is with Moody Bible Institute, serves as the Vice President Academic Dean, but also Professor of Jewish Studies. If you'd like to contact him, we have a link to michaelrydelnik.org. Don't even have to know how to spell his name because we've got the link right there. It makes it real easy. And if you'd like to know where he's speaking or maybe invite him to come and speak or be involved in some kind of ministry, we've made that available to you. But also have a link to moodyconferences.com, Opposing Antisemitism. Again, that link is there as well, and we'll talk about how you might be able to use it in just a minute. But I thought we might just establish something we've been saying, and that is that anti-Semitism is on the rise. And if you look at the FBI statistics, and I've looked at them at many times for hate crimes, first of all, I think they're overly inflated because we now know that some of the hate crimes are fake hate crimes. But just let's take the numbers as they are. It turns out that almost half of the attacks are anti-Semitic. And so, Michael, sometimes you have individuals trying to make a political point saying, well, hate crime is on the rise, implying that there's attacks on LGBTQ, attacks on Islam, on Muslims, on even African Americans. Not that I'm dismissing any of that, but oftentimes they don't point out that one of the reasons that's increasing is because of the increasing amount of anti-Semitism in this country. And that's something that we really, as a church and as believers, need to address, don't we?
Sure, and when you think about it, there's only probably about 6 to 7 million Jewish people in America, and yet more than half of all the hate crimes are targeting Jewish people. And that could be anywhere from vandalism to physical assault, so or bomb threats and things like that. The evidence here in Chicago is it's interesting to see the Chicago police right around every synagogue on Shabbat as Jewish people go to worship. On Saturday mornings, the synagogues are surrounded by police in every area. And if there isn't police, then there's private security to try and keep those places safe. It is a serious growth issue, these kinds of hate crimes. I think that the church needs to be aware of it. I think, unfortunately, when I've raised issues here with different church leaders, they're not real, for the most part, they're not real anxious to engage on this issue. I think it would be really vital for church leaders, for pastors, to speak up and say, hey, if they're going to go after God's chosen people, then they have to come through the church. We're going to stand with them. We're going to be supportive of them. We have voices. People listen when we call our congressmen, when we call our senators, when we call the president's house, the White House. They will listen if we will emphasize how important it is to recognize the problem of anti-Semitism and address it.
One of the things you talked about in the summit is, of course, how Christians can oppose anti-Semitism, how they can support the Jewish people. And one of those is to actually make our voice known. But I think the implication, what you're saying is not only pastors, but even Sunday school teachers listening right now, small group leaders, I think they need to do some kind of session on anti-Semitism and begin to understand the role of Jewish people in this culture, the great accomplishments they've made, that they are God's chosen people, and that they're under attack. And it seems to me that that's something lacking in certainly the way in which we go about teaching day in and day out in a lot of our churches.
Yeah, there was a physician at one time, he's now with the Lord, a Jewish believer named Arthur Kack, and he talked about anti-Semitism being endemic, like a disease that's always present, sometimes underlying, sometimes it approaches epidemic proportions. I believed, growing up, my parents survived the Holocaust, came to the United States in 1950, and both of them thought, the world has learned its lesson. We will never see anti-Semitism again. And I never dreamed in my life I would see Jewish...
I think I've lost you. Yeah, I guess we lost him, but I think, again, you can see where he was going with that. We'll see if we can reconnect up there in just a minute. But never thought he would see, of course, people marching in the streets. And I think a lot of us have had that same kind of idea. Who would have ever guessed that, people would want to tear down a Jewish flag or a flag of Israel and burn it? Who would ever think that there would be people marching in the streets supporting the Hamas, Hezbollah, Palestinian Authority, Islamic Jihad, whatever it might be? And so we'll see if we can get Michael Rydelnik back. But let me just mention, as we are trying to reconnect with him, that, again, we do have a link to this particular summit on opposing anti-Semitism. As I mentioned before, I'll hold up my booklet on anti-Semitism, which is a resource I'd love to put in your hands. Another booklet we could put along with that is the one on Israel, because sometimes there is a misunderstanding sometimes of how Israel came to be, and that certainly is an important issue. So these are some important topics that we really want to try to address every single day here on Point of View. And I might just mention that if you listen to Point of View, a couple of the speakers he's mentioned, of course, we have Michael Rydelnik on right now, but he mentioned Mark Jobel. He's been on the program with us. Dr. Mitch Glazer, who is the president of Chosen People Ministries, he's been on with us many times as well. Another individual that works with Chosen People is Darrell Bach, who's with the Dallas Seminary. We just mentioned Dr. Don Sweeting, who's actually the chancellor of Colorado Christian University. And of course, we just had the president of Colorado Christian University, Eric Hogue, on just a few minutes ago, and then some of the other speakers there as well. But I think we've got Michael back, don't we?
Yes. Right.
And you were, again, talking about the fact that you never thought you'd be seeing people marching in the streets, supporting and even talking about the need for Hamas and Hezbollah and Islamic Jihad to have their own country. And yet these are known terrorist organizations, aren't they?
Yeah, they're supporting terrorism. Listen, my name is out there, my email is out there, and after the summit, I personally got hate mail from people accusing Jewish people of all manner of evil, of conspiracy theories.
Sure. Well, unfortunately, we apparently have trouble with this audio there as well. So let me just encourage you, if you would want to know a little bit more, we'll just go to a break. And let me just mention again that we have a link to michaelrydelnik.org. And so if you'd like to contact him, we have that ability that you have there. Of course, he has various blog posts and resources, and then, of course, the summit there as well. So sorry about the technical difficulties, but we'll come back after the break and get into some other important issues, because, as you well know, we have more cabinet positions being filled out. Of course, most of them have to be actually ratified by the United States Senate, and some of them may be a little more controversial than others, so we'll talk about that. Do want to also get into the whole issue of what has been, if you will, the discussion in some of the Democratic circles about what is the next step. And so, again, you will notice that I'm posting some material, one by Neil Brown, who is a Democrat, who is a liberal, but is also somewhat critical of some of the things that have taken place. And you're now starting to hear more and more people using the phrase "woke is broke." Yeah, you just discovered that, huh? Well, nevertheless, we're seeing some of that as well. So I'm going to talk about certainly some of the people that would be filling out the Trump cabinet and giving you kind of some pros and cons there. Then one of the really controversial issues is, what about deportations? Very good piece by Byron York. And then, of course, one, I love this line, Bernie Sanders screams more cowbell. That would make sense to those of you that have ever watched Saturday Night Live, but we'll get to that in due course. But if you find yourself wanting to know a little bit more about either of our guests, you can go to the website, pointofview.net. If you'd like to find some of the articles we've posted, that's available there as well. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
The Bible tells us not to worry. And yet, there is a lot of worrying stuff in our world today. Thankfully, the Bible doesn't stop at telling us not to worry. God gives us a next step. He says we need to pray. But sometimes, even knowing what to pray can be difficult. And that is why Point of View has relaunched our Pray for America movement, a series of weekly emails to guide you in prayer for our nation. Each week, you'll receive a brief update about a current issue affecting Americans, along with a written prayer that you can easily share with others. We'll also include a short free resource for you in each email so you can learn more about the issue at hand. Will you commit to pray for America? Go to pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner at the top of the page to subscribe. Again, that's pointofview.net. Click on the Pray for America banner. Let's pray together for God to make a difference in America. Point of View will continue after this.
Thank you, Kerby. I really appreciate your program. You cover a lot of issues that a lot of us think about, I'm sure. And this is the first time I've ever called in, so I appreciate your input, too.
Oh, I thank God for what you're doing on Point of View. You guys have more influence across this country than I believe any of them in terms of tackling the issues and getting the truth out to Americans. It's getting to the point where truth just is bottled up on every hand. Every time you turn around, there's another big bottleneck against truth. I hope your listeners realize what Point of View is doing and supports Point of View in every possible way you can.
You know, I can't go to Washington. I can't do those things, so the only way that I can help is the way that God has provided for me, and to give some of that back to you guys. So, like you said, partnering with Point of View, because, you know, you can't do it alone. Thank you very much for what you guys do. Believe me, it's a needed thing, and I just hope everybody certainly would get on the bandwagon with you.
Point of View Radio Talk Show.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour, if you'd like to join the conversation, 1-800-351-1212, or just sit back and listen to some of the things we're learning about the filling out of the cabinet for the Trump administration. As I said yesterday, and it's worth saying again, this is unprecedented. I think that all of these cabinet officers are being announced so quickly at a time when, let's again put this in perspective, a week from ago, we were still just kind of reflecting on the win that took place on November 5th, and here we are today, November 14th, and I think now, if I'm counting correctly, a majority of the cabinet have been announced, and of course they will have to, in many cases, be ratified by the United States Senate, because the Constitution requires advice and consent, and so that has been the assumption. Let me also raise the issue right now, because it's been raised by other individuals, that given the fact that some of these particular nominees are controversial, That's an understatement, probably. There are ways in which presidents have in the past, and Donald Trump is willing to use the same tactics that have been used by others, Barack Obama being a good example of that, of ways, if indeed you can't get a confirmation during the regular hours of a United States Senate or Congress, there are, and I think this is a misuse of this particular situation, but there are recess appointments that can take place, and those were intended back in the days in which people were traveling by horseback or train to be in some of those even before you had trains. And so as a result, if Congress was in recess and we needed a whatever postmaster general, or we needed a secretary of war, now called secretary of defense, or whatever, that you wouldn't have to wait. There could be a recess appointment. Well, now we know that that is a game being played, but the game has been played by Democrats, so why couldn't the game be played by Republicans? So if indeed you come down the road and a Pete Hegseth or a Matt Gaetz or somebody like that is too controversial, that may be the way an individual is placed into that position. But let's, if we can, recognize that some of these appointments shouldn't be too controversial. You would hope that a United States senator who has actually worked on foreign policy issues for some time by the name of Marco Rubio would be pretty simple to appoint and to confirm as the head of the State Department. But again, let's see what Donald Trump had to say. He said, leading the U.S. Department of State is a tremendous responsibility. That's what Marco Rubio said, and I'm honored by the trust President Trump has placed in me. As Secretary of State, I'll work every day to carry out his foreign policy agenda. Under the leadership of President Trump, we will deliver peace through strength and always put the interest of Americans and America above all else. I look forward to earning the support of my colleagues in the U.S. Senate so that the president has his national security and foreign policy team in place when he takes office on January 20th. Again, usually the first week of January, you have Congress meeting. This is where you ratify, of course, the Electoral College. Can anybody forget January 6th, of course, that took place in 2021? But then also it's a time in which many of these individuals can be already hitting the ground running when they actually are then put into place when the president takes the oath of office on January 20th. So we'll see. I don't expect Marco Rubio to be too controversial. However, if you want to do some background research, we had a very good interview that we did, first with Marco Rubio a while back with his book. I might even see if we can pull some of those out. Maybe Megan can put those on our highlights for Spotify if it's not already up there. But we also did an interview with an individual that had been in the State Department, and that's Mike Pompeo, talking about how difficult it was to move the State Department in the same way that he found it much easier to move the CIA. So those diplomats that are part of the State Department in what's called Foggy Bottom, that's kind of an inside the Beltway kind of discussion of the location of where the State Department is, will be certainly key. So Marco Rubio, probably not so controversial, but certainly we will see how that plays out. Another one, and I've posted the article here about Tulsi Gabbard, could be controversial if for no other reason than she started out as a Democrat, then became an independent, and now a Republican, and yet as an individual that would be the director of national intelligence would hold the same kind of position that we were talking about yesterday, that was held by an individual that has been a member of Congress. And so it's not unusual for a member of Congress who has foreign policy interest to actually be the director of national intelligence. But again, this is how the announcement was made. I am pleased to announce that former Congresswoman and Lieutenant Colonel Tulsi Gabbard will serve as the Director of National Intelligence. For over 2 decades, Tulsi has fought for our country and the freedoms of our Americans. As a former candidate for the Democratic presidential nomination, she has broad support in both parties. Well, maybe not so much now, but that's what he wrote. She's now a proud Republican. Then, of course, he goes on to say, President, I know Tulsi will bring the fearless spirit that has defined her illustrious career to our intelligence community, championing our constitutional rights and securing peace through strength. Tulsi will make us proud. And so that is the statement being made of Tulsi Gabbard. And who would have guessed that someone, she's now in her 40s, but when she first ran, I think as a legislator in Hawaii, she was the youngest ever to be elected. She was one of the youngest ever to be elected to Congress, certainly one of the youngest to ever run for president, which goes back many years. And now, of course, will be, I think, there's probably pretty clear, I believe that she would have to have Senate confirmation as the Director of National Intelligence, so we'll see where that takes us as well. But when we come back, I want to also talk about another individual that will certainly be fulfilling a role that we've never really had before, and that is Elon Musk. But also with him will be Vivek Ramaswamy. As I mentioned in the first hour when we were doing the interview with Eric Hogue, Elon Musk points out that there are 428 federal agencies. To try to drive that home, he reminded us that there are more agencies than there are years that this republic has been in existence, which is a nice way of saying that we've created more than one agency a year. Of course, most of them have been created in the last 3 decades. But nevertheless, he wants to get that 428 federal agencies down to, and he picked a number, 99 federal agencies. If you don't think that will be controversial, well, you haven't been around Washington, D.C. any length of time. And so I want to come back and talk about that briefly before we get into some other issues, because it is, I think, important to recognize, as we talked about with Chuck Bentley on Monday, that we're headed in the wrong direction as a country. And the only way we're going to ever get close to even balancing a budget is increase income. There are some ways to do that. And the other is to decrease expenses. And when, again, Elon Musk is talking about trying to trim $2 trillion out of the federal deficit, that is going to be significant, but it's going to be a monumental task. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
This is Viewpoints with Kerby Anderson.
Elon Musk noted on X that giving more money to homeless charities in California did not seem to reduce the number of homeless people. In response, Konstantin Kisin reminded him of the Cobra effect, and he was surprised to discover how many people hadn't heard of it. Now, the Cobra effect is based upon a story which may or may not have taken place during British colonial rule in India. According to the story, the British wanted to reduce the cobra population and offered a bounty for every dead cobra. But the cobra problem got worse because people realized that they could profit from this bounty and began raising cobras in farms. Now, when the government finally became aware of this practice, they discontinued the bounty program. The cobra breeders then decided to release their worthless snakes into the wild, making the problem worse. In the past, I've talked about how the cobra effect surfaced in the attempt to combat racism. Anti-racist groups and organizations formed to combat racism, but they soon faced a problem. The demand to find racism was much larger than the supply. Soon we were hearing about such things as microaggressions, and the charge of racism was thrown around indiscriminately. The problem of homelessness in California, Kisin argues, came not only from the attempts to deal with failing, but also with the results of well-intentioned policies, the deinstitutionalization movement, whose goal was to free people of the tyranny of mental asylums. The mentally ill people released into the streets fell through the cracks. Today, cities are littered with tents and drug addicts on the streets. These are just 2 examples of many others that remind us that good intentions don't always solve social problems. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
For a free booklet on biblical reliability, go to viewpoints.info/biblical reliability. Viewpoints.info/biblical reliability. You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back once again, let me talk, if I could, for a few minutes about Elon Musk and the Government Efficiency Commission. Let me just hasten to add, as I certainly do sometimes when we talk about other individuals, when I talk about what Elon Musk is going to do and talk about some of the things that he wants to do in a favorable way, I'm not saying I agree with everything that Elon Musk has said, everything that Elon Musk has done, but I do think that he finds himself in a very unique set of circumstances as an individual, if you followed his history, that came here from South Africa, really was somewhat instrumental in the development of PayPal and a number of other things, and then just sort of launched out on his own. Did he benefit from government largesse? Oh, certainly, in terms of some of the benefits there. But for individuals that are looking for an individual that might be a good role model for entrepreneurship, I think he fits a pretty good category. And he, with this kind of eye towards efficiency and eye towards what could be very significant changes that can take place in a company, in a corporation, a business, or now the government, brings a lot to the table. And so, again, when you talk about the fact that we have 428 agencies, federal agencies, and many of them are overlapping, some of them are redundant. Some of them, quite frankly, are unnecessary. And as he gets to work on this, his goal is to actually implement this commission and end it by the 4th of July in 2026. Why? Because that would be, the 250th anniversary of this country. So it's talking about really an 18-month program of identifying and really beginning to carve out some of the very significant inefficiencies in the federal government. To put that in perspective, I'll give you a preview to my commentary that will be out tomorrow. I will be out teaching college students in a very great opportunity, and so we'll have Liberty McCarter, and of course you mentioned the other day by radio, Nathan Shackelford and others will be around the table, but my commentary is entitled Leviathan. Now, you've heard me talk about this because Ned Ryan actually has written a book called American Leviathan, The Birth of the Administrative State and Progressive Authoritarianism. And he actually, in the article we make available that is associated with my commentary, asks questions like, what if I told you the President of the United States doesn't really run our government, or that most people in Washington, D.C. don't really believe in representative democracy, or a government of, by, and for the people is just an illusion. Might be a little bit of overstatement, but the point he's making here is that we've had this administrative state that Ned Ryan talks about. Vivek Ramaswamy stopped talking about the idea of the administrative state because he had people like Charlie Kirk say, when you say administrative state, people's eyes just glaze over and they just get bored. So he's now started talking about the managerial class. You're hearing a lot of people talking about just unelected bureaucrats, but whatever you want to call them, or the deep state or whatever, we have a massive bureaucracy, which goes all the way back to the progressive movement, which was established by Woodrow Wilson. And the idea by some of those individuals is certainly intelligent individuals who serve for decades in the government can make better and wiser decisions than people that are elected by popular vote or even elected by the electoral vote. And this is why you have so many people in the bureaucracy that when a new sheriff comes into town, like Donald Trump, they can just look and say, yeah, you'll be here for 4 years, but I'm going to be here for 20, so I'm not going to pay that much attention to you. Or in some cases, I'm going to go out of my way to prevent you from enacting your agenda because I disagree with you. And so this is certainly something that has been a real problem. And while there are some people that still wonder whether or not there's a deep state, you can get my booklet that I wrote a while back on the history of the term deep state. It actually comes from Turkey, and the history of the fact that we do have a bureaucracy which is going going to continue unless we find some ways to reduce the size and scope of government. And that will be a beneficiary to, first of all, you, the American taxpayer, but also a beneficiary on the fact that some of these bureaucracies exist really to do nothing else except write more regulations. And Donald Trump came in wanting to get rid of 2 regulations for every new one. It very quickly got to be 15 to 1, and I think it eventually ended up to be like 20 to 1. And that is helpful because although we do need government regulations, some of them are hamstringing and preventing entrepreneurial activity. Some of these regulations, as I even recently posted in one of my commentaries, even on tariffs, are obviously written in such a way to help one particular company, one particular agency, one particular group of companies, and it isn't certainly helpful to the American people. But as we talked about with Chuck Bentley on Monday, he reminds us that Elon Musk was really concerned about this in one of the All In podcast, which is a podcast done by called All In Summit, which are pretty much a gathering of people that are very wealthy, high income individuals, millionaires, billionaires. He said America is going bankrupt extremely quickly, and everyone seems to be sort of whistling past the graveyard on this. And, of course, Chuck Bentley talked about the fact that this is due to something else that's developed from the 20th century, not only this progressive movement, but another thing called modern monetary theory, where you have economists, even politicians, arguing that really our currency is kind of like monopoly money. And you see that sometimes if you were to run out of money on your monopoly game, you would just issue some kind of IOUs till it all gets back, and then you get rid of the IOUs. And that's the same kind of thing. We can ignore deficits. We can ignore a $36 trillion deficit and national debt, I should say. And as a result, every time we have to pay our debts, we can just print more money. And of course, you know what happens when we print more money. More money for the same number of goods, the value of your dollar is worth less. And that is certainly one of the big concerns here as well. So this is why it has been really important for Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy to begin to identify some areas of government which, first of all, maybe aren't even needed anymore. Other areas of government where you have 2 different agencies that actually overlap and are conflicting with one another. I've told stories on this program before of individuals trying to build buildings and say it was impossible to do it legally because if I followed the rules of one agency's, by definition, I was breaking the rules and laws of a different agency, and how in some cases the cost of doing business has simply been, I'm just going to build the building, or I'm going to develop the shopping center, I'm going to develop this area, know fully well that I will be sued. I know of some very ethical businessmen in this community that went out of their way to try to go and get the Texas legislature, for example, to change some of the laws and rules and regulations. But all of the conflicting ideas themselves, interestingly enough, make it very difficult to move ahead. And so if you really want an entrepreneurial spirit, one that's going to be good for the American people, I think Elon Musk is really an individual that probably is at the right place at the right time to make some of those changes that need to be incorporated. I might just mention as we go to a break, Elon Musk figures prominently in my commentary today because he was on X noting that if you give more money to homeless entities and charities in California, it didn't seem to reduce the homeless population. And Konstantin Kisin reminded him of the Cobra effect and was surprised how many people hadn't heard of it. Of course, the Cobra effect is based upon the idea that the British, wanting to reduce the cobra population in India, offered a bounty for every dead cobra. But what happened? Unintended consequences, people started raising cobras in farms so that they could make more money. Well, when the government found out about that, it discontinued the bounty program. Now these cobras were worthless, And so these worthless snakes were released back into the wild, and it went from making a bad problem even worse. And the argument that he makes is when you talk about homelessness or many other topics, you can see that the so-called unintended consequences happen. And so anyway, my commentary today is about the Cobra effect, once again illustrating one of the things that maybe next time we talk about homelessness we'll get into in more detail. But even in that particular commentary, Elon Musk, in a peripheral way, shows up in the commentary. So if you'd like to read about it, it's available on the website, pointofview.net. When we come back, though, let's talk about a couple of these controversies. One is, okay, are we going to have targeted deportations? Are we going to have mass deportations? How is that going to take place? Byron York has done a very good job of explaining that, and that article's on the website. We'll talk about this right after these messages.
It almost seems like we live in a different world from many people in positions of authority. They say men can be women and women men. People are prosecuted differently or not at all, depending on their politics. Criminals are more valued and rewarded than law-abiding citizens. It's so overwhelming, so demoralizing. You feel like giving up. But we can't. We shouldn't. We must not. As Winston Churchill said to Britain in the darkest days of World War II, never give in, never give in, never, 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 never yield to force, never yield to the apparently overwhelming might of the enemy. And that's what we say to you today. This is not a time to give in, but to step up and join Point of View in providing clarity in the chaos. We can't do it alone, but together, with God's help, we will overcome the darkness. Invest in biblical clarity today at pointofview.net or call 1-800-347-5151. Pointofview.net and 800-347-5151. Point of View will continue after this. You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back once again, let's see if we can talk about deportations. And again, we do not shy away from controversial topics, so I'm going to devote a segment here to try to give you some facts and figures, which you're not probably going to hear in too many other venues, because you have some people that say, we should deport them all. Well, that's never going to happen. And others, as soon as the first bus pulls out with people being deported, or the first plane pulls out, you're going to actually have two things happen simultaneously. Number one, there are going to be some people that are here illegally that are going to wonder if they're next. But number two, you're going to have the hue and cry that comes from the mainstream media, the establishment media, arguing that we're getting rid of people that could be fine, upstanding citizens in America. Neither of those two extremes are true, so let's talk about the reality. The most recent figures that we have from Immigration and Customs Enforcement, and this is on the second page of this article by Byron York, so you can look it up for yourself. As of September 30th last year, 2023, there were 1,292,000, almost 293,000 people in the country who are here illegally, who've had full legal due process, and have received a final deportation order from an immigration judge. Now, that's a year ago. What we need to estimate is probably 1.3, maybe as high as 1.6 million people in this country that have already been processed and are supposed to be deported. You might say, I didn't know that. Well, because they are supposed to be deported, but there was absolutely no will on the part of the Biden-Harris administration to deport them. Which brings me back to one of my trivia questions I love to ask whenever we talk about deportation. Which president has deported more people than any other president? Most always I get the answer, Donald Trump. No, it's Barack Obama. Now, part of that's not fair because Barack Obama's had 8 years and Donald Trump had 4. But even if you do a 4-year to 4-year comparison, again, you've got to understand that when Barack Obama was in office, even though he's a Democrat, even though he's a liberal, there were other liberal groups that referred to him in a casual sort of way, almost a snarky way, as the deporter-in-chief. So something happened from a time in which, we're going to talk about Bernie Sanders in the next segment, in which we actually said we don't want people here illegally because they're affecting unions and other people that are our constituency, to now let's bring them all in because there may be future voters. So first of all, we've got to understand that deportation is something that should have been taking place. And now that you have Donald Trump tapping Tom Homan, that's Homan, Tom Homan, as the border czar. By the way, there's no title that. We already knew that when we talked about that with Kamala Harris. But he is the one that will be in charge of that, in part because I thought he might actually be the Secretary of Homeland Security, but I think he'd just be too controversial in that regard. And so he says we're going to concentrate on public safety threats and national security threats first, because those are the worst of the worst. So it's going to be the worst first. Then how that's going to be done, we know a record number of people on the terrorist watch list have crossed this border. We know a record number of terrorists have been released in this country. We've already arrested some who were planning attacks. So again, the argument he's making is we're going to focus on the worst first. As I said, as soon as those buses head down to the border, as soon as planes head out to other parts of the world, you're going to hear a lot of complaints. And part of that, to be fair, is due to the fact that the president-elect isn't always precise about his words. Let me give you an example. On November 2nd, in a rally in Salem, Virginia, President-elect Donald Trump pledged to launch the largest deportation of criminals in American history. And he said that about a dozen times. But then other times, you can go back to his rally in South Bronx on May 24th, pledged to immediately begin the largest criminal deportation operation in the country's history. And so in some respects, he's talking about criminals, but sometimes he just says we're going to deport as many as we can. So what are we talking about? Well, I think, again, you have to understand that there are going to be people who are going to be against deporting individuals generally, and because of that are certainly not going to tell you that the people that are being deported are here who actually have gone through a full legal due process. And frankly, the first individuals that most likely will be deported will indeed be the individuals that, according to Tom Homan, now the incoming border czar, would be the worst of the worst. And so that is certainly the case. And as a result, the question is, the vast majority of these individuals that we want to actually deport are not currently in detention. Some are. So the first thing is clear out those individuals that are behind bars. But very quickly, these orders of deportation are going to have to require going into communities in order to actually find those individuals and to deport them. Now you run into the fact that many of these so-called sanctuary states and sanctuary cities have said, we're not going to cooperate with the federal government. Just saw an interview the other day with the governor of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And you have to, I think, if you're an honest person trying to just understand this situation with deportation, ask, well, let me understand, Madam Governor, are you saying then that you will not cooperate when there are known criminals in Massachusetts, known terrorists in Massachusetts? You're not going to cooperate with the federal government, and you're going to do all you can to block that because you want to what? Do I understand you correctly? Want to actually prohibit the removal of individuals who are known criminals, individuals who are known terrorists from your state? If the American people understood that, I think it would be difficult for that governor to win re-election. But I think there's going to be a real attempt oftentimes to blur all of this. And I've already seen some of the pundits talking about, well, we're going to be deporting grandmothers and aunts and uncles. Well, if the grandmother and aunts and uncle is a criminal or a terrorist, yeah, maybe we will. But that is, of course, to play on your emotions. One of the great ironies, and again, I encourage you to read this article by Byron York, is that the memorandum that was created under the Homeland Security head Alejandro Mayorkas may be the one that they use. Because, again, in that memo, he said, and then this is, again, the current head of Homeland Security under Biden-Harris. He says, we will prioritize for apprehension and removal non-citizens who are a threat to our national security, public safety, and border security. That first group would be what? Terrorists and spies. The second group is criminals. And the third group are those who are seen as threats to border security. What does that mean? Well, again, quoting again from the current Secretary of Homeland Security, a non-citizen is a threat to border security if A, they are apprehended at the border or port of entry while attempting to unlawfully enter the United States, or B, are apprehended in the United States after unlawfully entering after November 1st, 2020. And so that, of course, brings us to what about the individuals that have come under Biden later? And, of course, we'll see where that takes us. But right now, you really would have difficulty characterizing these as mass deportations unless your definition of mass deportations is deporting 1 million people who have actually been through due process. They've actually gone through legal due process and have received final deportation orders from an immigration judge. My theory is, although when I bring this up, most people roll their eyes and doubt me, my theory is once we start those buses rolling, once people start being put on airplanes to be deported, I suspect that many other individuals will self-deport. Maybe not all, maybe some that are terrorists will do their best to hide out, but some criminals recognize it's only a matter of time before I get caught, only a matter of time before I am taken from a set of circumstances, and maybe I would be better heading back to my country of origin rather than to actually find myself behind bars and eventually handcuffed and put on an airplane or on a bus. So we'll see what happens, but that, I think, is my initial sort of deep dive into the issue of deportation. And if you start hearing various pundits talking about how outrageous these deportations are, just remember that we, even a year ago, had 1.2, almost 1.3 million people that have already been through a full legal due process and have already been ordered to deport from an immigration judge. Those are the first ones to go out the door. Let's take a break. I have more to cover, and we'll do that right after this.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Let's talk about what's going on in the Democratic Party. And what I thought was so interesting is there are some people that have expressed their outrage at just the way in which the Democratic Party raised funds for the attempted election of Kamala Harris. And a good way to see that would be to maybe go to the Dark Horse podcast, not necessarily recommending it, but Dr. Brett Weinstein, an individual, was a professor at Evergreen College. We've talked about him before, evolutionist, atheist, but nevertheless a fair-minded individual who was kind of ousted because of all the wokeness and craziness and everything. Well, they had Dr. Heather Heyen on, and they were talking about the situation which she described as Robin Hood in reverse. What are we talking about? Many of you probably received text messages. Nobody received as many text messages as I did. Now, because you've got to understand that, first of all, I oftentimes go to websites that are not only Republican-based but Democratic-based, not only conservative but liberal. I've been a precinct chairman. I've, of course, contributed to various parties and things of that nature. So I've seen a lot that perhaps nobody else has seen. But if you were a possible Democratic donor, what you would see are text messages that oftentimes would say, we need you to give $5, $10, $15. Matter of fact, if you were ever out on YouTube, you would see that Kamala Harris, Barack Obama, Tim Walz, and others wanting to get these small donations. And then we're interestingly enough told that that there is like an 8 times match. And one of the things that Brett Weinstein and Heather Heyen were talking about is, if you have all this big money, this 8 times the match, why do you need the small money? And the implication was, well, they wanted to make it look like there was more of a groundswell of support. In other words, basically, the Kamala Harris campaign was funded by big donors. But then, in order to make it look like it wasn't just funded by big donors, we wanted to get a mass of small donors. But then we were asking these small donors to give, money that they probably couldn't afford, $10, $20, $25, $50, whatever it might be, so they could turn right around, and here's the other bottom line, pay $1 million to Oprah Winfrey, $1 million to Beyonce, who then appeared as if they were there spontaneously, but were getting paid big dollars in order to actually attract crowds. Or in one case I talked about the other day, spent $100,000 actually rebuilding his studio so that Kamala Harris didn't have to travel to that studio. Just unbelievable amounts of money that were spent. And who was funding it? A lot of these small Democratic donors. So you can see why Dr. Heather Heyen was talking about this as being Robin Hood in reverse. Well, some of the other criticisms are coming about whether wokeism was working, and that brings me to my piece, which again is from an individual that would not agree with many things we talk about on this program, Neil Brown. He called it Bernie Sanders Screams More Cowbell. Now, if you understand cowbell, you might remember the old Saturday Night Live skit where they're singing a song, and my producer was reminding me which song that was, but we'll leave that off to the table for the moment. And then you have an individual coming in going, more cowbell. And this is a way of saying, let's have more of something that isn't working, I guess is a good way to say that. And again, Neil Brown puts it this way: as Americans voted decisively for a candidate who explicitly rejects nearly everything that Bernie Sanders advocates, Vermont's senior senator insists that the Democratic Party isn't liberal enough. I can't say this without a little bit of a smile on my face. The mindset of the far left, he says, seems to be that the working class just needs more of what they just voted against. For Bernie, the answer is always more cowbell. He points out the fact that, when Scranton, Joe, that was Joe Biden, came into office, he was really presented as a pro-energy, pro-growth, pro-worker, old-school Democrat. But then, and again, Neil Brown obviously is more of a liberal but not a leftist, said once the Elizabeth Warren camp took over and the Bernie Sanders camp took over, they then ensued an overt shift. And so we went from position that Joe Biden had of all of the above energy strategy to one that actually was an attempt to do all it can to completely get rid of everything from liquid natural gas facilities, which sent the wrong message to our allies, he says, around the world. And it was a betrayal of tens of thousands of energy workers in Pennsylvania. Then he goes on to take another issue. He says, then this massive drive, he says, for student debt relief, he says, is another example of how the left wing of the party is out of touch with the working class Americans. By sending out over $400 billion to college graduates, the non-college working class Americans received a clear message. Democrats believe contributions to society by the college educated are more important than mine. Again, these are some statements being made by a Democrat, Neil Brown. He takes on another one then, because as inflation eroded their spending power, these workers didn't get tens of thousands of dollars in government paybacks or grants or student loan freedom and all the rest, but instead they saw more and more privileged Americans cashing those checks. Then he goes on to say that the broad anti-business rhetoric of Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, he says, is out of step with everyday needs and struggles of Americans, and talked about the fact that we used to talk about paychecks and pocketbooks. Now we don't. Then finally, he says that the paralysis of Joe Biden at the border and an immigration policy was actually crucial and critical to the defeat of Kamala Harris. And so the point he's making is Bernie Sanders might have been right about one thing, because Bernie Sanders has said that the Democratic Party has abandoned the working class. You think? That is certainly evidenced by all of those graphs and charts, some of which we posted on Monday. But it is also true that he is completely out of step by saying we need more liberal, we need more cowbell, as he says. If anything, Neil Brown argues, even though he's the director of the Progressive Policy Institute, he recognizes that some of these policies were not a good idea, and his argument is we must recenter the Democratic Party, we must listen to Americans and fashion policies that reflect an understanding of what they need and want. We cannot bend further to the left's, and this is his words, delusional insistence that the working class just doesn't know what is best for them. So he may be the head of the Progressive Policy Institute. He may call himself a progressive, but I think what he's saying is, even though I'm a liberal, even though I'm a Democrat, these leftists are crazy. And if we head down this road, we're going to lose every single election in the future. So, again, I'm giving you a chance to hear from these individuals what they're saying to their own constituency, the Democratic Party right now. And even though Bernie Sanders thinks we're not liberal enough, I think there are other, maybe hopefully a little more common sense voices in the Democratic Party that might want to steer it in a different direction. We'll see how that plays out, but it's our last article on the website. If you'd like to read it, cover to cover, it's a fascinating read. That's all we have for today, though. First of all, I want to thank Megan for helping not only, of course, producing the program here and producing our Spotify best and highlights, but also the commentaries that we are making available to you. But also want to thank Steve for producing the program, helping us understand what is going on, and we look forward to having you join us tomorrow on our weekend edition right here on Point of View.
There is an old military saying, if you don't have communications, you don't have anything. Good information is the key to success, not only for those in the military, but for all of us. You can't take positive, productive, and helpful action if you don't have good information. Point of View Radio's main role is to provide good information, and we distribute that information not only here through our radio program, but online and through our various social media channels. You know that big tech isn't exactly a supporter of what we do, so you need to take intentional steps to keep in touch with us. Make sure you follow us on Twitter at Point of View RTS, which of course stands for Point of View Radio Talk Show, at Point of View RTS. Also, make sure you follow us on Facebook, Point of View Radio Talk Show. We won't overwhelm you, usually just one post a day with information on our guests and what's important. The information you need when you need it. Point of View Radio Talk Show on Facebook and at Point of View RTS on Twitter. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.